So the United States has recognized the legitimacy of Israeli settlements in the West Bank, sort of, kind of. They're not coming out and saying, oh, well, these are a part of Israel, and these are, so great and everything. They're kind of taking before the U.S. had a stance of these are absolutely not legal, these are an abomination, and they must go. That's been the official U.S. position since, the 70s. In 1978, there was a declaration by the State Department, hey, this violates the Geneva Convention, it's a war crime, Israel can't keep doing this. And then Israel has continued to do it, for the last 40 years now, and eventually, we got to the point now that Pompeo just said, we're not going to say that this old opinion we had is wrong. We're just going to throw it out and say it doesn't really matter anymore. So that's kind of what he's saying. He's saying it's like, okay, sure, it violates international law, but we're not really going to concern ourselves with the international law. By international law, of course, we're referring to the Geneva Conventions, which is it's a pretty basic, line threshold to meet if you're a government. It's still the Geneva Conventions doesn't stop you from doing most of the terrible things that governments do, but I mean it at least sets some basic rules for you shouldn't, design your bayonets in a way to destroy men's intestines. You shouldn't, fire on defenseless civilians. You shouldn't slaughter your prisoners of war. Basic stuff like that. And one of these rules laid down in the Geneva Conventions is, hey, if you're at war with, someone and you occupy their territory for a while, you're not allowed to go start settling your people into their territory to try and displace the native population. That is, an invasion, an occupation, an annexation, and we're not supposed to do that anymore because we live in the civilized era. That's the idea. Now, of course, in reality, are there still, countries that like to invade other countries and dominate them? Yes, and the U.S. is one of those countries. There are a few powers, China, Russia being two of the others that like to do that. They want to feel powerful, but they don't do it in the classic way of annexing them and expanding their borders and then moving their people in. What countries tend to do nowadays is they'll invade a country, overthrow the government, and then install a puppet regime that's friendly to them. And, maybe there will be some of their people there, acting as advisors and things or in business, kind of like what China does in Africa. If you go to lots of African countries, you're bound to meet lots of Chinese people in the capital city. And those aren't settlers so much as they are just sort of people working there. Israel, however, is conducting sort of the old school imperialism to where after which war was it? Was it the 67 war, I guess, is when they took back the West Bank, which had been held by Jordan since the 1948 war. What they've been trying to do is move their population into the West Bank slowly so that it gets integrated into, what is officially Israel. Because we know that, part of the Zionist ideology is that, Israel is everything west of the Jordan River, and that, by having this arbitrary green line, they're just dividing Israel, and so they don't want to do that. So they want to move their people, and they want to settle them in the historic regions of Judea and Samaria, as they call it. Geneva Conventions be damned, because as far as they're concerned, that's been our property for, however many thousands of years since God gave it to us. And I don't need a deed because, I have the Torah. And it tells me that even though, even though I'm making a blood and soil racial argument that, hey, I'm the rightful, my people, meaning, if you trace my ancestry back, our ethnicity, we are the rightful owners of this, and no other people have a right to go there, despite leaving aside that is a very politically incorrect racial argument. It's not even true because, most of the Jewish people who have immigrated to Israel, they kind of they've done a lot of genetic testing now that DNA is more prominent than it used to be, back in 1948, and they found out actually a lot of those people have, their DNA kind of matches the areas that they came from, meaning that, the Eastern European Jews have, seem to be Eastern European, genetically speaking. And the same thing with the Jews from other parts of the world, is that, it turns out, hey, you guys actually were at home all along. And, more controversially, but, quite ironically, there's been testing done on the so-called Arab invaders who have taken over Israel, and that Israel, that the Jews are trying to reconquer it from. And it turns out that they seem to be much more closely related to the ancient Israelites, based on the remains that they've found of people, in that area. So it seems more like the case that, sure, there were some Jews that left in the diaspora during Roman times, and went out and evangelized and converted a lot of new people to Judaism, which is how we got, such a big modern Jewish population. It wasn't just through reproduction. But also there were a lot of Jews who decided to stay, and of course there were revolts after the so-called diaspora by the Jews against the Romans, and eventually these people were converted to other religions. But that's a bit of a tangent, not really the topic here, but it is pretty ironic. So back to Pompeo, his point is basically that, the Geneva Conventions have become difficult and that they're not really conducive to peace, so we're just going to pretend that they don't exist. And so he says, hey, any questions of the legality of these settlements should just be handled in Israeli courts. So as long as Israel says that its settlements in the West Bank are legal, well, then they're legal. But which would seem to imply that the West Bank is Israeli territory. That's what Pompeo seems to be implying, although he specifically stated in this same statement that I don't mean to prejudge the status of the West Bank in this statement. It's like, but that's what you did, because if what matters only in this area is the Israeli courts, well, then that means that this is a territory of Israel and not an occupied territory of some other country. Now, the obvious next step here is for Netanyahu to announce something that he's promised for a while, and that is the annexation of not all of the West Bank, but of the settlements, which is a very clear first step towards annexing the West Bank. And once the existing settlements are annexed in, well, then it'll be pretty easy, for the Israelis to start, grabbing more territory around it, because, again, at this point, they don't have to worry about international law, according to Pompeo. They just have to worry about Israeli law. So as long as they change Israeli law to legalize, a lot of these settlements, the big ones, are legal. There are illegal settlements too, that are by, more radical Zionists that couldn't get approval from the government to go settle in the West Bank, and they're like, damn these Arabs, they need to get out of my country, and so they went and chased people off their farms and started living there. Reminds me a lot of Zimbabwe, in the 2000s, when they were chasing white people off their farms and saying, hey, this is my land, you get out of here, Now, there's a lot of, I guess you could say pro-Palestinian activists who actually think at this point that the best thing the Israelis could do would be to annex the entire West Bank, and then make all the people who live there Israeli citizens and give them equal rights. However, I don't think that that's going to happen, because the reason why a certain faction of the Palestinian activists support this is because they know, hey, we're a substantial portion of the population, and at least if we're citizens, we can actually vote on what Israel's doing to us and make some difference in the political process. We'll have some power. And of course, the Israelis don't want that, so that's why they haven't annexed the West Bank. That's why they're trying to move their people into the West Bank, so that over time, they will outnumber the Arabs there. They still don't, though. And so that's why they can only annex the settlements themselves, because they want to make sure that, the settlers are able to vote, but they don't want the Arabs that live around them to vote. And so, even though the plan is eventually to annex all of the West Bank, it is going to be a very slow and arduous process, because it's going to be this process of having to stake out new settlements. I mean, it's kind of like how in the olden days when the king would send a priest to set up a new diocese on the frontiers of the country to try and Christianize the Slavs. They had to have these little outposts of Western civilization on the frontiers to try and I guess, civilize the nomadic tribes. Of course, in this case, though, the Israelis don't want to, Israelize or civilize the Arabs. They just kind of want to push them out, and that is the problem with with the Israeli brand of blood and soil nationalism, is that Arabs are irredeemable. They can never be fully members of society, because they can become Israeli citizens, sure, but they'll never be Jews in there, I guess, unless they convert. But, Judaism seems to have given up on trying to convert people a long time ago. They make it pretty difficult, if you're an adult male, because, you gotta, that whole circumcision thing, if it's not done at birth, it's not something you really want to go through. So it looks to me like the progression of, Israeli conquest over this, fairly tiny area is progressing, although very slowly. I mean, and when you think about how small of an area this is, it's pretty remarkable that they've been able to do it this slowly. Because normally the way to conquer a territory is just by ripping off the Band-Aid with something like, the Nakba, which they did in 48, but that didn't get rid of all the Arabs. It just kind of pushed them into Gaza and the West Bank, most of them. And that's kind of the problem that Israel's been stuck with. They didn't finish the job of ethnic cleansing back then, and so they've been trying to do it slowly without anyone noticing. And I don't think they're doing a great job of it. Frankly, I think that they should have given up after 48 and said, "Hey, we've got a pretty good stake here, and we don't want to stir up any more trouble." But then again, I think they've done a very good job, sort of propagandizing the American population, at least, into thinking that Israel has to occupy these areas and take them over eventually, for the sake of their security. So maybe I'm the dumb one for saying that that they should have just been happy with what they got back in 48. So if you gained anything of value out of this video, I'd appreciate you clicking that like button and sharing this video. And if you haven't already, please do subscribe, because I do upload every day, and I'd hate to have you miss one. So I'll see you folks back here tomorrow.